Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Plummer. In this episode, we talk with Stephanie Collins and Niels de Haan about group responsibility and historicism.
Thanks for listening. Well, I'm happy to introduce two guests on the podcast today, Stephanie Collins and Niels de Haan. Stephanie is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. Niels is a researcher and lecturer in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Vienna and an research associate at the African Center for Epistemology and Philosophy of Science at the University of Johannesburg. Both Stephanie and Niels work on collective agency and collective responsibility, and they've recently co-authored a paper on the subject of today's episode, Group Responsibility and Historicism, which is forthcoming in Philosophical Quarterly, and we're excited to have both of them on the show together to talk about their collaborative work. Welcome to the show, Stephanie and Niels. Could you each start by saying a bit about yourself, your work, how you came to be interested in working on issues related to free will?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So it's really great to be here. So I started off my PhD in 2010 with, for some reason, a real bee in my bonnet about questions like, what does it take for a group to be an agent? Can groups intend things? Can groups act? Can they bear obligations? Can they be responsible? And these sorts of questions have really occupied me for about the last 15 years. I sometimes joke that a whole philosophy career could be made just by taking all the things that philosophers say about humans as regards action and mind and freedom and morality and seeing whether those things can also be said about group agents.
Yeah.
There's so many interesting issues there. So far, I've mostly focused on the ethics side of things, as you kind of implied.
Mm-hmm.
So I've worked on concepts like duty in my 2019 book, Group Duties, and culpability in my 2023 book, Organizations as Wrongdoers. But obviously, the topic of free will kind of lurks in the background of these moral concepts. And when we're thinking about groups and free will, lots of philosophers tend to think group agents can't be free in the same kind of ways that humans can be free, because group agents are ultimately controlled by individuals, or maybe group agents are constrained in various ways by like their structures or constitutions. And so if that's correct, then that'll affect what ethical demands we can make of groups, which is kind of what ultimately concerns me.
Mm-hmm.
So in my current work, I'm starting to look at the role of the profit motive in group agency and freedom and morality, and asking whether groups that are kind of orientated around the profit motive are meaningfully unfree in a way that kind of affects what we can ask of them, morally speaking. So again, free will is kind of in the background of all this moral stuff for groups. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks, Stephanie.
Yeah, thank you very much for having us on the show. It's a great pleasure. My main interest in philosophy has always been ethics. I think, especially moral responsibility. I think ever I started studying philosophy, Harry Frankfurt's famous paper on alternate possibilities and moral responsibility was one of the first papers I just couldn't stop thinking about. And I'm sure most listeners are aware. Frankfurt introduces this, genius case of Mr. Black, who can and would manipulate Jones's brain so that Jones does exactly what Black wants. But Jones does it anyway for reasons of his own, and then Jones could not have done otherwise, and yet Jones seems morally responsible. And it's such a fun case to think about, and it really got me into this debate about, what is free will, whether it's compatible with determinism and moral responsibility. There's so many interesting questions. What kind of control matters? What are our abilities?
Mm-hmm.
And I think what's really fun is that many of your initial intuitions are questioned, and there are so many plausible views to consider. And this makes it an extremely interesting and challenging debate. And I've always been interested in it. And in my work, like Steph, I focus mostly on collective ethics. In my PhD, which I completed in 2021, I focus on the question how to make sense of the moral judgments that seem to target groups, both deontic and evaluative. So when we blame a corporation for exploiting its workers, who is it that we blame? Is it the managers or the corporation? Maybe both. And my goal is to develop a comprehensive ethical theory that can make sense of our moral judgments about both individuals and groups, though this is, of course, quite a long-term project. But because the concept of moral responsibility is so important for these issues, it's only strengthened my interest in these, in free will and these sorts of relevant questions. Right. So if, as Steph said, if groups are to be morally responsible agents, what kind of control do they need? Do they need free will? I mean, what would that even mean? These sorts of questions that keep me up at night in a good way.
Right.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, very cool. Well, since we're planning on talking about a challenge for historicism, we should start out by saying what historicism is. So can you guys explain the view and maybe how it differs from structuralism?
Yeah. So according to historicism, whether someone is directly morally responsible for an action depends partly on their history before the action. So for example, if you have a history of indoctrination or manipulation that led you to perform this action, this can absolve you from moral responsibility. Now, according to structuralism, whether someone is directly morally responsible for an action depends only on their psychological structure when they perform the action, regardless of how they came to be psychologically structured this way. So their history is in a way irrelevant. Now, I use the term direct responsibility, which is a technical term, and this is important because historicists and structuralists agree that someone's history can matter for what they call indirect responsibility. So suppose you freely decide to get drunk to test your drunk driving skills and you hit someone. Your responsibility for hitting someone is indirect, right? So at the time of the accident, you may not satisfy all the conditions for moral responsibility because you're drunk, but you are indirectly responsible because we can trace back the outcome to your free choice to test your drunk driving in the first place. And at that time, you did satisfy the conditions for moral responsibility. So when it comes to this is where structuralists and historicists agree, so regarding indirect responsibility. But what they disagree about is the relevance of history for direct responsibility. So for example, according to Harry Frankfurt, you are responsible for your choice to get drunk and drive if you identify with the choice when you make it. And this is even the case when your identification is a result of manipulation or indoctrination. Now, historicists think that how you came to be the person that makes this kind of choice, that this matters. So if your history involves manipulation or indoctrination, and this played a significant role in you deciding to get drunk and drive, this may absolve you from moral responsibility. Now, the debate centers largely around manipulation cases, because at least on the face of it, these cases seem more difficult for structuralists. So I mentioned earlier the famous case of Frankfurt, and here Black does not actively interfere with Jones's decision-making, right? He would interfere if Jones would decide differently, but he does what he wants anyway. But there are examples where there is active interference. So in the literature, one famous case concerns Beth. So imagine that there are two philosophers, Beth and Anne, and Beth values many things above philosophy based on careful reflection over many years. And Anne is someone who values philosophy and her work more than anything else, right? So imagine that Anne is this crazy productive philosopher, the ideal worker, if you will. Now, suppose that the dean of their department hires a team of psychologists and new wave brainwashers without Anne or Beth knowing about this. And the dean wants Beth to become like Anne, basically. And the psychologists determine that Anne's hierarchy of values is what makes her so productive. And the brainwashers instill those very same values in Beth. So they remove any value that competes with these new values, and Beth is basically turned into a psychological twin of Anne. Now, this is what Alfred Melle calls a radical reversal case, right? So Beth's values are radically reversed. Now, because of the manipulation, she just values different things. Now, imagine that as a result of all this, Beth breaks a promise to her friend. So she promised to help her friend move, but Beth realizes she doesn't have time for this because she needs to finish her 10th paper of the year. And as a direct result of the manipulation, she values her work now above her friendships, which is why she makes this choice. Now, the question is Beth morally responsible for breaking her promise? So again, this is where historicists think that the history matters. Beth is not morally responsible for breaking her promise because her history includes the manipulation of her values that led her to make this choice. And structuralists will say, or at least Harry Frankfurt will say, that Beth is morally responsible for breaking her promise, provided she identifies with her choice at the time that she makes it. Now, Steph and I think many historicists, think that this is rather counterintuitive, but of course, this is part of the debate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thanks. That's really helpful. So mostly this debate is about individuals. But Stephanie, you mentioned earlier being interested in applying questions about individuals to groups. So there are lots of different historicist proposals out there in the literature. Could you describe one or two that you think might be applicable to groups, or at least that one could try to apply to groups, and then say whether you think there are any historicist proposals that definitely won't work for groups?
Yeah, so one example of a historicist proposal that Niels and I think potentially can apply to groups, although we think ultimately it gets some wrong results, comes from Michael McKenna. So McKenna focuses on what he calls unsheddable values. So unsheddable values are values that the agent can't get rid of at will. And McKenna suggests that maybe an agent is responsible for an action only if any unsheddable values that underpinned that action arose from a history where the agent had the opportunity to kind of critically assess, critically endorse, and sort of reflectively sustain those unsheddable values using abilities that the agent herself possessed rather than kind of abilities of someone else. So the idea is kind of that the agent's unsheddable values were acquired through means that kind of sit within the agent's own abilities. And if the unsheddable values that underpin a particular action of yours have that kind of history, then you're going to count as responsible. That's going to be what makes the difference for you being responsible for that action. So that's one proposal. Another example, which is going to sound very similar, but in the literature on this, there's so much wrangling about the details of these kinds of principles. But another example comes from Ishtiaq Haji and Stefan Kuipers. So they focus on what they call an agent's evaluative scheme. So an agent's evaluative scheme includes things like the standards that she believes ought to be used to assess reasons. It includes her long-term goals that she deems worthwhile, the deliberative principles that she uses to decide what to do, and the motivation to actually act on all those standards and goals and principles. And now, according to Haji and Kuipers, you are responsible for an action only if the action derives from an evaluative scheme which is authentic. These authors say different things about agents that have only just appeared versus agents that have been around for a while. But to keep things simple, let's focus on agents that have been around for a while. So they say if you're an agent that's been around for a while, like Jones that Niels mentioned, or like Beth that Niels mentioned, then your evaluative scheme is authentic if it evolved under your deliberative control. Okay, so both McKenna and Haji and Kuipers give us the result that Beth is not responsible for breaking her promise to her friend, which seems like the right kind of result. So for McKenna, that's because Beth's unsheddable values were acquired through a means that bypassed her deliberative control. And for Haji and Kuipers, it's because her scheme failed to evolve in a way that was under her deliberative control. Now, you also asked, Taylor, whether there are any historicist proposals that Niels and I think won't apply to groups. And the answer is yes, and it's kind of interesting. So there's this very influential book, which I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar with, from John Martin Fisher and Mark Revisa, 1998 book called Responsibility and Control. And in that book, Fisher and Revisa argue that for you to be responsible for an action, you must have a history of viewing yourself as an agent and viewing yourself as an apt target of attitudes such as anger, indignation, and resentment, kind of the so-called reactive attitudes. Now, Niels and I think that this kind of proposal, we call it a kind of a subjectivist proposal. So it's a proposal that relies on how the agent views themselves. We think this kind of subjectivist proposal is not going to work for group agents. Simply put, that's because many huge organizations, for-profit ones in particular, the ones that I'm interested in, face huge economic incentives never to view themselves as responsible agents. So think of Enron or the worst kinds of tabloid newspapers, or think of like BP after the Gulf of Mexico oil spill. So these organizations seem to commit the worst sorts of offenses in our social and political world. So we think it's implausible that these kinds of organizations are never morally responsible. Yet these huge for-profit corporations seem like they can easily fail to meet Fisher and Rivers's criterion because they can just lack a history of viewing themselves as responsible. They just, don't engage in our kind of second-person moral practices, as kind of a Strawsonian might put it. Now, Fisher and Rivers point out that for humans, there are huge psychological and social costs to not viewing yourself as responsible. So humans tend to meet Fisher and Rivers' criterion, right? Because it's really what we are disposed to have a history of viewing ourselves as responsible. Mm-hmm. But Niels and I worry that organizations, particularly ones that run for a profit, just don't face the same kind of pressure, psychological and social pressure, to view themselves as responsible. So for this reason, we think that the correct historicist principle for groups had better not be one that relies on how the group views itself. It had better instead be a condition that's kind of more objectivist than that. That's about how the agent actually is rather than about how the agent views themselves. So that's going to be something more along the lines of what I described from McKenna or from Hadji and Kuipers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what are some examples of groups that you take to be morally responsible, and what are some features of these groups? You've already mentioned a couple of the groups like BP. So what are the features of these groups that will be important to keep in mind when we turn to your challenge?
Yeah, thanks. I guess it might be easiest to start with a brief introduction to the debate on group responsibility, as I suspect not all listeners are very intimately familiar with this debate. So consider the judgment that British Petroleum is to blame for the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010. Right, this was a huge environmental disaster, and there were a few deaths. Mm-hmm. So when we look at such a moral judgment, moral individualists think that these judgments about groups will always reduce to judgments about individuals. So, for example, several managers are to blame for inadequate oversight. But moral collectivists, which Stephanie and I are, claim that not all these judgments about groups are fully explicable or analyzable in terms of judgments about individuals. Nor is it going to be the case that these judgments about groups are always made true by judgments about individuals. Right? So it's possible that the group is to blame, but not necessarily its members. Now, to support this, the collectivist usually gives two arguments. So first, they argue that organized groups qualify as moral agents, just as the average adult. So organized groups like corporations or states or universities, these have an organizational structure and they have decision-making procedures. And it allows them to adopt and pursue representational and motivational attitudes. So they can adopt beliefs, goals, intentions. But they can do all this while being sufficiently rational so that we might want to call them an agent. So just as you and me, these groups can perform actions. Now, collectivists argue that these group agents potentially have the basic capacities for moral competence. So they have moral understanding, like just as you and me, they can understand moral reasons, they can gather evidence, they have the relevant kind of control, they can control their actions in light of their moral understanding. And because of this, these groups are potentially appropriate targets for moral responsibility. Now, I said a bit earlier that there is this idea that the group is to blame, but none of the members might be to blame. This is what they sometimes call non-distributive group responsibility, or corporate responsibility, if you will. Now, to defend the possibility of this, they invoke cases that involve so-called responsibility gaps. So these are cases where a group agent clearly does something morally wrong, but each member seems to have a legitimate excuse for their involvement. And so their individual responsibility is going to be defeated in a way. This creates this responsibility gap. So there's a strong intuition that someone must be responsible for what it is that the corporation did, and yet no individual seems responsible. And the idea is that we must fill such gaps with group responsibility to bring our moral accountability books in order, as Philip Pettit puts it. Mm-hmm. Right. So when we look at, for example, BP, they're to blame for this environmental disaster because, well, BP was grossly negligent and they failed to develop and implement safe work practices. But it's possible that BP was grossly negligent without any individual being to blame to the extent necessary for that judgment about the group to be true. Right? So it's possible that we can't hold any individual responsible for the whole ecological disaster, but we can hold BP responsible for this. Now, the idea is not that group responsibility replaces individual responsibility, but it's a different level of responsibility, and it doesn't really entail or remove the responsibility of members. Okay, so I hope that this is a bit of a helpful introduction.
That's great.
So these organized groups, they have features that are liable to manipulation, just as Beth. And I already talked a bit about decision-making procedures. So in the work of Christian List and Philip Pettit, they focus on, especially on decision-making procedures, and they show how this might lead the group to make immoral decisions, even though no member supports that conclusion in a certain way. So they vote in a certain way, and it diverges from the group's point of view or the group's decision. And then in Peter French's work, we can find a focus on organizational structures. And he shows that inadequate structures of reporting and oversight and communication or command, that all these things can lead to immoral group actions. And in the work of Carol Rovain, we can find the idea that groups have a rational point of view, and this is sort of unified by a central life project that really is part of the group's identity. And this can come apart and conflict with the projects of members. And the idea is that the group is responsible for the pursuit of that project. Now, in light of this, we focus on what we call the constitutive ends of groups. Now, this is a bit different from how some other people understand constitutive ends, but we think of it as an end that is constitutive of having a certain practical identity. So if the agent doesn't adopt any means towards the end, and it fails to consistently pursue it, then at some point the agent just stops being an agent that has that particular practical identity. So for example, if a for-profit company does not pursue profit at all, then at some point it just stops being a for-profit company. So I highlighted 3 important features. So we have decision-making procedures, organizational structures, and constitutive ends. And we call the first 2 formal features, and the constitutive end we call substantive features of the agent. Now, what's interesting is that the decision-making procedures and structures are much more explicit for organized groups than for the average person, especially given the limitations of psychology. So it nicely illustrates, in our view, that it's not just the agent's values that are important for historicism, as we saw with Beth, but that the mechanisms the agent uses to make decisions and how those mechanisms came about are just as important for historicism. And part of the paper will be to show that these formal and substantive features can both be the target of manipulation.
Yeah, this is fascinating. So let's turn to some cases. Could you talk through some cases where groups seem morally responsible and yet fail to satisfy some historicist conditions on moral responsibility?
Yeah, sure. So in the paper that Niels and I published on this stuff, we discussed 4 papers, but in the interest of time, I'll outline 2 because they're kind of, as these cases always are, they're a bit long-winded, right?
Yeah. Right.
So the first case is called safety, and it goes like this. So suppose at T1, and for many years prior to that, there was an organization, and that organization prioritized and prioritizes worker safety. So the organization arrived at this value of valuing its workers' safety through a long-term rational reflection on competing values. And then at T2, this organization is sent into involuntary administration through no fault of the organization. Make up whatever economic story you want about why this kind of involuntary administration thing happens. Now, the administrator, this new administrator, imposes a new decision-making procedure on the committee that oversees production in this organization. So the administrator insists now that the committee will vote only on certain premises where the committee's view on conclusions are kind of derived from its view on the premises rather than the committee voting on the conclusions directly. So let me give an example. So suppose the committee votes on 3 premises, right? First premise, it votes on, should we decrease the hours that the safety engineers work? And then it votes on the premise, should we delay machine maintenance, routine machine maintenance? And then it also votes on the premise, should we increase factory output? Okay, now we can imagine a situation where each member of this committee only votes for 2 of these 3 premises, And any two of these premises alone would not be sufficient to compromise worker safety. But the votes are arranged such that the committee ends up kind of having a majority vote on all three of these premises. So implicitly, the committee votes for the conclusion, let's compromise worker safety, even though no individual member of the committee would have voted for that. And indeed, no individual member of the committee believes premises that entail that conclusion. Okay, so the case is set up in this way to show that none of the committee members are responsible for compromising worker safety, right? Because none of them individually holds views that would entail that, holds views on premises that would entail that. I should say as well, this kind of structure of case is often called a discursive dilemma. There's this kind of voting situation where the view on the conclusion is kind of follows from the group's votes on the premises. And Christian List and Philip Pettit discuss this at length in their work on group agency. So anyway, so the administrator imposes this decision-making procedure on the committee. And the administrator is not to blame for imposing this procedure on the committee because she's seen it work really well in other contexts. She doesn't know this complicated philosophical literature on the discursive dilemma, which shows that actually this kind of voting procedure is kind of problematic. And that's not her fault, right? Because who reads that stuff? Right, except for me and Niels. So via this new premise-based decision-making procedure, the committee kind of quote unquote decides to compromise worker safety. No member supports that conclusion, as I said, and the administrator doesn't either. Nonetheless, at T4, the final moment in the story, the committee's decision to compromise worker safety leads to an accident in which several workers die. Okay, so the important point here is that according to the historicist principles that I outlined earlier, so from McKenna and Hadji and Kuipers, the organisation looks like it's not responsible for the deaths of the workers. So if we look at McKenna's principle, notice that the history from which the organisation's values arose, that is the value of compromising worker safety or not caring about worker safety, the history from which that value arose was not a history that afforded the organisation the opportunity to critically assess, critically endorse, or sustain that value. After all, the organisation's new decision-making procedure, which was imposed upon it, kind of blocked direct consideration of the value of worker safety because this new decision-making procedure insisted, no, our new decision-making procedure is that we just look at the premises, we don't look at the conclusion. So the organisation was not able to reflect upon this value of not caring about worker safety, which in the moment of the accident was unsheddable. Maybe it was sheddable across a long time frame, but at least in the moment of the accident, the organisation had found itself with this value that seems unsheddable at that moment in time. And then regarding Hadji and Kuipers' principle, notice that the administrator's interference, where she comes in and imposes this decision-making procedure, that is kind of a outside influence on the organization's evaluative scheme, what they would call the evaluative scheme, where that outside interference on the evaluative scheme kind of bypassed the organization's capacities of deliberative control. So it looks like the administrator kind of manipulated the organization in the same way that the dean manipulates Beth in the Beth example that Niels started with. But notice as well, the administrator's kind of not to blame for this either. That's kind of an important part of our attempt to set up the case. So in this kind of case, Niels and I think that the organization itself is responsible for the deaths of the workers, but existing historicist principles can't really get us there. So that's one case. I'll try and be quicker with the second one. So here's the second one. The second one is called labor. So here, suppose that at T1, a clothing company is created to make clothes, obviously, and it's created to make clothes ethically, with garment workers receiving fair wages and great benefits and whatever you want. At T2, the company starts producing clothes, but it's producing them at a loss, and it continues for a few years. But the clothes are popular, so let's say it looks like a great bet for investors. The company looks like a great bet for investors. At T3, the owners of this clothing company start publicly trading their shares. And that's a decision that's made by each owner as a private individual, though each owner kind of hopes that the company's ethical reputation will entice ethical shareholders.
Mm-hmm.
So the company itself isn't consulted by the owners when the owners decide to sell, and it's not required to be consulted by them. By T4, the company has now acquired these legal responsibilities to these new shareholders who have bought these shares, legal responsibilities to maximize profit. And the company has good reason to think that if it fails to maximize profit, the shareholders will abandon the company. That would cause significant harm to the local community as the company provides many jobs. Okay, so the company here develops this new unsheddable value, what McKenna would call an unsheddable value, of maximizing profit for shareholders. At T5, the last moment in the story, the company has no reasonable option other than to cut production cost, which leads to sweatshop labor being used in its supply chain. Okay, so here again, according to McKenna's principle, this company isn't responsible, it seems, for its use of sweatshop labor, because the company couldn't critically assess or endorse the value of maximizing profit. It just kind of got lumped with it through this fact of now acquiring these shareholders. And within the relevant time frame, this value of maximizing profit, again, was unsheddable for the company. Likewise for Hadji and Quapers, so the sweatshop labor that ends up getting used by this company resulted from the company's evaluative scheme, where that evaluative scheme was caused in a way that bypassed the company's capacities of deliberative control. So again, the Hadji and Quapers principle seems to say that this organization is not responsible for its use of sweatshop labor. Again, Niels and I want to say, no, this company is responsible. We need some sort of historicist principle that can get this company on the hook. So those are two cases that we think pose problems for existing historicist principles.
Yeah,
those are interesting cases.
Interesting. Yeah. So, all right, we've talked about historicism and your challenge. What's the trilemma that you present in the paper?
So we think these cases illustrate an important choice point in the philosophy of responsibility. So the trilemma we raise basically involves three options that you might want to take in response to our cases. So first, you might want to just reject group responsibility, right? So if the group agent is not to blame and it's not even a potentially blameworthy entity, then, well, the whole problem for historicists basically disappears. Second, you might want to accept group responsibility, but you just reject historicism, and instead you might accept some form of structuralism, right? So this would allow you to accommodate group responsibility in the case that we discussed. Or third, you might just want to revise historicism in a manner that it becomes compatible with group responsibility in our cases. So perhaps a helpful way to think about it is to think it from a theory construction kind of perspective. Say that you're trying to build a complete ethical theory. You want to have a comprehensive theory of moral responsibility. Obviously, this theory should be coherent. You want these parts to fit seamlessly with other parts. And think of it as trying to reach a goal of a reflective equilibrium between all your theories, your principles, your concepts, your considered judgments. But then when we turn to our considered judgments about groups, we find these difficult cases that seem to put pressure on the theory that you've developed to explain cases involving individuals, right? So historicism. Now, each of these options can be seen as a possible route to kind of making your theory coherent again, right? We get rid of the tension. But Steph and I think that the first two of these options come with significant problems of their own.
Yeah, maybe we should ask you to say something about those first two responses first and what costs they come with. So you said one was to reject group responsibility, at least in these cases. Another was to reject historicism. Could you talk through the difficulties for going these routes?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, let's suppose you want to reject group responsibility. So if you want to reject group responsibility, then a natural thing that you might want to do is instead place responsibility on the individuals, right? This is something that so-called reductive individualists about responsibility like to do. They get rid of group responsibility, just blame the individuals. Of course, we've constructed these cases, we've tried to construct these cases such that, no, you can't do that. No individual is responsible. I kind of talked through the details of how that works in the worker safety case. In the sweatshop labor case, we can imagine, the original owners really believed that the new shareholders would be ethical. The new shareholders couldn't possibly have tried to use their power to stop the company from using sweatshop labor. We can tell stories on which no individuals are responsible. Mm-hmm. So if you reject group responsibility, if you're a reductive individualist, then you have to end up viewing these cases as tragedies, basically, in which there's just no responsibility to be had. At least no responsibility of the kind of backward-looking, blame-producing type. We can debate about forward-looking responsibility, but let's leave that aside for now. Yeah. So we think that's kind of costly for a couple of reasons. So first of all, organizations, in fact, are held responsible in cases like ours, and indeed our cases are kind of inspired by real-world examples. So, for example, The Body Shop is an example of a company that changed its values quite a lot when it started being publicly traded and acquired obligations to shareholders. So we think that this idea that these groups in these cases are responsible is kind of embedded within a fairly widespread and ingrained social and political practice of responsibility holding vis-a-vis group agents. And I suppose Niels and I actually maybe disagree a little. I think I'm a little bit more of a practice-dependent kind of theorist than Niels is, maybe. But for the purposes of the paper, we say so. I think this really matters, right? That our practices are this way regarding blaming these groups. But for the purposes of the paper, we sort of say we should reject these practices only as a last resort. Mm-hmm. So only if there's no other way out. And I think Niels at least will sign on to that. We also think there's a slippery slope involved if you view our cases as tragedies. And here we actually point to some of your work, Taylor, where you argue that there's no relevant difference between manipulated agents on the one hand, and on the other hand, agents who are kind of just unlucky with regard to their dispositions and capacities. So if our examples are simply tragedies, and if Taylor is right about this analogy between manipulation and bad luck, then it would kind of mean that we would end up having to get rid of all kinds of judgments of responsibility for all kinds of human individuals with regard to their dispositions and capacities. So we think if you start allowing sort of bad constitutive luck, bad luck in how an agent is constituted or how an agent is set up to get that agent off the hook for responsibility, that's going to be a very big cost to pay. Right. Okay, so that's the first option, rejecting group responsibility. Second option is rejecting historicism. So Niels at the very beginning mentioned structuralism, which is the prime alternative to historicism. So if structuralism is true, then agents can be responsible for outcomes even if they have a manipulated history. So maybe, great, these organizations can be responsible under a structuralist framework. Their histories of manipulation make no difference to their responsibility. Perfect. But of course, structuralism faces the problem of Beth that we started with, which is this huge problem in the literature. So you have to deal with that. Now, there are things that structuralists have to say about Beth. And again, Taylor in his work has said some stuff. We think that, I won't go into it here perhaps in the interest of time, but we think the things that structuralists say to try and warm us up to thinking the right kinds of things about Beth won't work for the group cases. The main reason being that we think these groups are really responsible, whereas Beth, maybe she's a tiny bit responsible, maybe she's not responsible at all. But in any case, these groups should be very strongly held to blame. Yeah. And the kinds of ways that structuralists will try to deal with something like Beth don't get enough responsibility. They don't get the level of responsibility that we want to give to these groups. So we think structuralism is not going to be a good way to go for these group cases.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so that's why we don't like either of those two options very much.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the first two responses. The third response of the trilemma is to revise historicism, and you consider a couple ways one could go in that direction. So could you explain what sort of revisions that you consider in the paper?
Yeah, so we we're sort of focused on trying to find a variant of negative historicism. Again, a pretty technical term in a technical debate, but it basically means that the agent needs to lack a certain history. And we want a view that rules out BEF's responsibility, but that, of course, allows for there to be group responsibility. And we suggest two principles that separate BEF from the group cases. And these principles we consider are certainly not the final word, but we think that they are important addendums to historicism. So more is to be said, but this is at least some way to make progress. So first, we argue that organizations can be expected to guard against manipulation to a much greater extent than individuals like BEF. Right? It doesn't seem very reasonable to expect BEF to guard against brainwashing dictated by an overzealous dean. I mean, this seems a bit extreme. But this is not the case for organizations, right? For them, manipulation is a part of life, insofar as you can speak of life. Right? So they're constituted by other agents. They have clear structures, procedures, and policies that are the target for manipulation. And all these things make an organization very liable to manipulation by either its own members or by external agents, right? Hostile takeovers are always a danger. So because of this, we think organizations can be expected to guard against manipulation much more because, well, they're prone to it. And so given that, we defend what we call the guarding principle. So again, it might be a bit technical, but here's the principle. So for an agent to be morally responsible for an action to any degree, the agent must not have a history in which the agent did all they reasonably could have been expected to do to avoid manipulation. And yet, nonetheless, the agent was manipulated, which was the direct cause of the action in question. Right, so, of course, the crucial question here is, when is it reasonable to expect an agent to have guarded themselves against manipulation? And we argue that there are, well, at least four interrelated factors that seem to matter. So first, we have the context in which the manipulation takes place. Then we have the target's evidence concerning the likelihood of manipulation. We have the selected means of manipulation. And we have the target's evidence concerning the vulnerability of aspects of their agency to manipulation within that very same context. Now, if we turn to BEF, BEF presumably has no evidence that indicates the dean's interference is very likely, nor that her value system is especially vulnerable to manipulation while working at the university, I hope. But even if BEF had some evidence that she could expect some manipulative behavior from her colleagues, the measures taken by the dean are obviously so extreme within a workplace context that it's just unreasonable to expect her to guard herself against this kind of manipulation. But we think it's not the case for the organizations in our cases. So, for example, in safety, the organization could have explicitly enshrined worker safety into their constitution so that no committee or whoever could easily overrule such a commitment. Right? This is quite reasonable to expect from the organization because, well, they operate in a business context where profit motives routinely place pressure on their ethical commitments. The organization quite plausibly has evidence that there are many parties with strong interest to interfere with how it makes decisions, and so the likelihood of manipulation is quite high. Any attempts to sort of interfere with their way of making decisions that impact its ethical commitments, these are not measures that can't be foreseen. And finally, the organization quite plausibly has evidence that especially their costly ethical commitments are a very likely target of manipulation in the business context, right? It's the main thing that costs money. So we think something similar will hold for the labor case. The company could probably have done more to protect their costly ethical commitment to avoid exploitation in their either production or supply chain. So there are all these different ways in which it seems much more reasonable to expect organizations to guard themselves against manipulation than it seems for BEF. All right, so that's the guarding principle. And then there's another principle that we concocted. The second principle concerns how the agent pursues or responds to a manipulated feature. Right, so the organization gets manipulated in a certain way, and the question is, what do they do as a result? Now, what these cases show, and I think this is probably the case for many other manipulation cases as well, is that how the agent responds is typically not fully set in stone. Right? So the agent goes through a process to decide what steps they should take given these features that are manipulated. And we think this potentially opens the door for responsibility. right? So because the decision-making of these organizations is much more explicit than the average human being, this is quite helpful for illustrating what we think is sort of like a deliberative gap that can arise between having a manipulated feature and the agent's implementation or pursuit of that feature, right? So in safety, the organization is not responsible for the imposition of this new decision-making procedure by the external person. And in labor, the organization is not responsible for the imposition of a new constitutive end of producing shareholder profit. But once these formal or substantive features exist and when they're sort of pressed upon the organization can be responsible for downstream choices. So, for example, compromising worker safety or using sweatshop labor. And the point is that there is this kind of intermediary deliberative step between the manipulation and the action for which the organization is responsible. Right? So the agent, in a way, considers what they should do in light of their manipulation, but this manipulation doesn't determine the exact manner of performance. And although very little time may pass during this process, and it might be that they lack the opportunity to reverse the manipulation, we think that this sort of indirect nature of the manipulation can still render an organization highly responsible for the action. So this brings us to our second principle, which again is quite technical, but bear with me, the manipulation principle. So for an agent to be morally responsible for an action to any degree, the agent must not have a history in which the agent underwent manipulation that bypassed its capacities of deliberative control, where that manipulation imposed formal or substantive features on the agent, and these features determined the manner in which the agent performed the action in question. Right? So this last part is quite important because if it really determines the manner in which the agent performed the action in question, then there is no intermediary deliberative step, right? So then the agent is so completely manipulated that everything is set in stone. And in those cases, of course, the agent is not responsible. Now we take it that Beth's case is kind of like this. So she's so completely manipulated that her choice of not living up to the promise is not really something that is anything that's up to her. It directly comes from the value system. But if that's not the case, then we can create a case where there's this kind of complete manipulation. And we think those kinds of cases are still going to be a bit difficult to deal with for structuralists. So on our view, the responsibility can come in degrees. So how much you are responsible for whatever it is that you're responsible for. And the larger the role manipulation plays in determining how the agent performs the action, the less responsible the agent is going to be for that action. And the more the agent did to guard themselves against manipulation, the less responsible they're going to be for actions that result from manipulation. But of course, at some point, it might be all the way down to zero if there's too much manipulation.
Right.
But the crucial part we think that needs to be highlighted is the agent's amount of discretion. So Taylor, for example, in some of his very interesting work, has argued for opportunities for reversing the manipulation playing an important role in understanding the degree of responsibility. But on our view, we think Beth is not responsible at all, not even a little. This is not to say that we don't think like opportunities to reverse the manipulation can be important, and it may affect someone's degree of responsibility. But we think our cases show the importance of discretion above anything else. And of course, the two principles we propose, they're only addendums to historicism. A complete account would involve probably quite a few other principles, and plausibly one of those would maybe involve the opportunity for reversal. But so to conclude, we propose two principles, quite technical, but it's the guarding principle and the manipulation principle. And our hope is that these principles together allow us to develop a more complete version of negative historicism that can account for group responsibility in all the cases that we discuss, but where we don't have to say that Beth is morally responsible for what she does as a direct result of the brainwashing.
Yeah,
that's great. That is kind of technical, but I will say, folks can go and check out the paper if they want to look at the principles in print and wrestle with it more. We'll link that in our show notes for the episode too. Thank you both so much for joining us, for coming on the podcast together to talk about this paper. Where can listeners go to follow your work?
My page on philpeople.org is usually up to date, so that might be the easiest way to follow my work.
Yeah, I'm also on Phil People, and that's usually up to date, but even better is my website, stephaniecollins.xyz, which is always up to date.
Nice. Yeah, we'll link both of those in the show notes as well. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot for having us.
In our next episode, we'll talk about whether and when a state has the standing to punish citizens for criminal behavior, and our guest will be Tommy Shelby, Caldwell Titcomb Professor in the Department of African American Studies and the Department of Philosophy at Harvard University.